Just after a night of heavy rain, with water still lingering across the yard, Trieu Duong stepped out holding baby Truc Lam and quietly noticed something was wrong. The chicken coop roof had shifted just enough to leave it vulnerable. He didn't rush to fix it. Instead, he carried his daughter back inside, choosing to care for her first, feeding her, settling her safely, before returning to face the problem as the day slowly faded. But as the light grew dimmer, could he finish everything in time without ever taking his eyes off what mattered most? If a quiet moment like this ever felt familiar to you, leave a comment. I'd really like to hear your story. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind a quiet, damp stillness that settled over everything. The yard was still wet, small puddles scattered across the uneven ground, reflecting the pale morning light. The air felt heavier than usual, carrying the faint scent of soaked earth and leaves. Trieu Duong stepped outside slowly, holding Truc Lam close against his chest. She was awake, her eyes quietly observing the world around her, calm and curious like she always was in the early hours. He didn't rush. His steps were careful, avoiding the deeper patches of water as he made his way toward the back of the house. The chicken coop stood there, slightly darker from the rain, its roof still dripping in slow, uneven drops. From a distance, nothing seemed too wrong, but as he got closer, he noticed it. A section of the thatched roof had shifted just enough to leave a small gap. Not broken, not urgent, but not something he could ignore either. He paused for a moment, looking at it in silence. The kind of problem that could wait, but only for a little while. Truc Lam made a soft sound, her small hand resting lightly against his shirt. He glanced down at her, and just like that, his attention shifted. The coop could wait a bit longer. Without hesitation, he turned back toward the house. Inside, the space felt warmer, protected from the dampness outside. He moved with quiet familiarity, preparing a simple feeding for Truc Lam. She lay in his arms, relaxed, trusting, her tiny fingers occasionally curling and uncurling, as if reaching for something only she could feel. He adjusted the cloth beneath her gently, making sure she was comfortable before beginning. Time moved differently in moments like this. There was no urgency, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of care. He waited patiently as she fed, watching her small expressions change, subtle but meaningful. When she finished, he didn't move right away. He stayed there for a little longer, letting her rest against him, her breathing soft and even. Then slowly, he stood up and walked toward the wooden chong near the doorway. It was placed where light could still reach her, but not too harsh. Just enough for her to feel the presence of the outside world without being exposed to it. He laid her down carefully, adjusting the thin blanket so it covered her just right. For a brief second, her hand caught the edge of the fabric, holding onto it without realizing. He noticed, and a faint smile passed across his face. He stayed there a moment longer, making sure she was settled. Only then did he step back outside. The light had changed. It was softer now, no longer the pale gray of early morning, but something warmer, calmer. The yard still held traces of the rain, but it felt less heavy, as if the day was slowly finding its balance again. Trieu Duong walked back to the chicken coop, this time without stopping. He reached up, examining the shifted section of the roof more closely. It wasn't severe, but it needed to be fixed properly, not just placed back, but secured stronger than before. He began working in silence. Each movement was steady and deliberate. He removed the loose pieces one by one, checking their condition before placing them back. His hands moved with care, tying the bindings tighter, reinforcing the weaker spots. It wasn't rushed work. It was the kind that required attention, patience, the kind that would hold, even through another night of rain. Every now and then, he paused, not because he was tired, but because his eyes instinctively turned back toward the house. From where he stood, he could just see the doorway. Inside, the small figure on the shong remained still. The blanket hadn't moved much. One tiny hand still rested near the edge, barely visible from this distance. He watched for a second just to be sure. Then he returned to his work. There was something quiet but firm in the way he continued, a balance between what needed to be done and what mattered most. The roof would be fixed before night came again. The coop would be safe, and inside, Truc Lam would still be there, resting peacefully, exactly where he left her. The day carried on like that, without noise, without urgency, but filled with intention in every small action. The light continued to fade slowly, stretching shadows across the damp ground as the afternoon moved closer to evening. By the time Trieu Duong secured the last section of the roof, the sky had already softened into a muted, golden gray tone. He tightened one final knot, pulling it firm with a quiet sense of certainty, then paused to look over his work. The thatched roof now sat evenly again, each layer pressed down and bound more securely than before. It wasn't just fixed. It felt stronger, prepared. He stayed there for a moment, eyes tracing along the edges, making sure nothing had been missed. The chickens inside moved softly, unaware of the small repair that would keep them dry through the next rain. A faint breeze passed through, carrying the coolness of the wet ground with it. Trieu Duong exhaled quietly, then turned his head toward the house once more. The doorway remained open, just as he had left it. From this distance, everything looked still. No sudden movement, no sound reaching him. Just the quiet presence of home waiting in the background. He didn't rush, but his steps naturally became quicker as he walked back across the yard, his feet landing more confidently now that the ground had begun to dry. As he stepped inside, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The air felt warmer, calmer, holding on to the soft traces of the afternoon light. Truc Lam was still lying on the wooden shong, just where he had placed her earlier. The blanket had shifted slightly, one corner loosened, but she remained peaceful. Her small hands still rested near the edge, fingers gently curled as if holding on to something invisible. He moved closer, lowering himself beside her. For a moment, he didn't touch anything. He simply watched. Her breathing was steady, her face relaxed in a way that made the entire space feel quieter. There was something grounding about it, something that pulled him fully into the present, away from everything outside. Carefully, he reached out and adjusted the blanket, pulling it back over her shoulder. His movements were slow, almost instinctive, making sure not to disturb her rest. When his hand brushed lightly against hers, her fingers reacted slightly, tightening for just a second before relaxing again. That small response was enough. A faint smile appeared on his face. Not exaggerated, just quiet and real. He stayed there a little longer, resting one hand lightly on the edge of the chong, as if anchoring himself in that moment. The sounds of the outside world had softened. No more dripping water, no more shifting leaves. Just a steady stillness settling in as evening approached. After a while, he stood up again. There were still small things to finish before night fully arrived. He moved around the house with the same calm rhythm, checking what needed to be checked, putting away what needed to be put away. Nothing felt rushed. Each action followed naturally from the last, like a quiet routine shaped by care rather than urgency. As the last of the daylight faded, he returned once more to where Truc Lam lay. This time her eyes were slightly open, not fully awake, but aware enough to notice the presence beside her. Her gaze moved slowly, finding him without effort. There was no confusion, no hesitation, just a quiet recognition. He leaned down slightly, bringing himself closer into her view. "Still here," he whispered softly, more to reassure than to say anything. Her fingers shifted again, reaching lightly in his direction. He placed his hand near hers, allowing her to hold on to one of his fingers. The grip was gentle, almost weightless, but steady in its own way. Outside, the sky darkened completely. Inside, the space remained calm, held together by small, quiet moments like this. The repaired roof stood firm behind the house, ready for whatever weather might come next. The yard had begun to dry, and within these simple walls, everything that truly mattered was already in place. Trieu Duong didn't think about the next day or the next task. For now, this was enough. He stayed beside her until her eyes slowly closed again, her breathing returning to that soft, even rhythm. Only then did he gently release his hand, making sure the blanket was still tucked properly before sitting back slightly. The night settled in fully, wrapping the house in a quiet sense of safety. And in that stillness, nothing felt missing. After a night of heavy rain, Trieu Duong steps into the damp yard with baby Truc Lam and notices the chicken coop roof has shifted slightly. Though the damage isn't urgent, he chooses not to fix it immediately. Instead, he brings his daughter back inside, gently feeds her, and lays her down to rest near the doorway. Only when she is calm and safe does he return outside. As the afternoon light softens, he carefully repairs each section of the roof, making it stronger than before. Throughout his work, he often glances back toward the house, quietly checking on her. When evening comes, he finishes just in time and returns inside, where a small, peaceful moment with his daughter brings a sense of warmth and completion to the day.